As soon as you say end time, they say, whoa, the end of the world. When's it going to be? And you can see this mask of fear. I'm not telling you the end time is coming. I'm telling you, you live in it right now. Daniel chapter number 7, verse number 4. The first beast was like a lion. We have the eagle used continually to depict the United States of America. You see it on governmental documents. We are at the generation for which these that you will not miss one segment of understanding the end time, because I've had many people tell me it's changed their life forever. Many of the major prophecies of the Bible are given to us 2, 3, some of them as high as 4 or 5 times. There is not any chance it's not going to happen, because it's in your Bible, it's prophesied, and the prophecies always coming back.
Nation and kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world, and then shall the end come.
The dream of world government is alive and well. The International Criminal Court is considering investigating possible crimes by U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. Should there be a court above the U.S. Supreme Court that could place Americans on trial? We'll talk about it on today's edition of End of the Age. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't realize that there is a one world court where you could be placed on trial, then you're underinformed. Because there is. We're going to tell you a lot about that today, how it formed, and what the ultimate goal is. Now, the main thing I want to talk about today is the big struggle in our world between those who believe in one world government and those who believe in the nation-state structure of our world. This struggle is immense. A lot of what you feel going on right now is between the establishment who wants one world government and the Americans who want to retain national sovereignty. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I know I just boiled it down to its simplicity, but you need to realize that is in fact where we are right now. We are in this huge struggle. Don't get confused with all of the fog that's out there. You hear so many things, but when it's all said and done, there is one element in our nation that believes the nation state is now obsolete and that we should surrender American sovereignty to a new world order. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please don't ignore what I'm saying. In the meantime, President Trump has burst on the world scene, and he says, oh no, we're definitely going the wrong direction, and we were going fast. We need to reassert American sovereignty. We need to enforce our borders, strengthen our borders, and we need to maintain patriotism. So those are the two big camps. When everything else is said and done, it's globalism versus national sovereignty. By the way, which side are you on? Now, we're going to talk about it today, and we're going to tell you some things you may not know. I would guess that 75% of our listeners today will not know anything about the International Criminal Court. Even though you could be arrested and sent there without the protection of the U.S. Constitution nor the Bill of Rights, that could happen to you. It is happening to people right now. So we're going to talk about it today because it has hit the news this past week since the International Criminal Court is investigating the possibility of putting U.S. soldiers on trial for things they did in Afghanistan that the International Criminal Court thinks may be a violation of international law. So that's where we are today. You will not want to miss this program because it's so vital, it's so important. Now, I remember when the International Criminal Court was born, we fought it on this program tooth and nail. We tried to stop it. Well, maybe we did some good because at least the United States of America rescinded its signature from the Constitution of the International Criminal Court, and yet it's still out there hovering in the shadows, ready to strike. I'm going to tell you a whole lot more about it on today's edition of End of the Age. So I'm going to ask you one more time, are you a globalist or do you believe in American independence? That's the big question you got to decide. I want to spend some time with you today talking about the International Criminal Court. It all began as early as World War I. Those people who believed in a world government knew there had to be a world court in order to enforce the laws and the edicts of that one world government. Well, they pushed continually from the early 20th century until the establishment of the United Nations. However, the nations of the world were too jealous to defend their sovereignty. They were not going to allow that level of encroachment, so it was blocked repeatedly. Then after World War II was over, they began to put ex-Nazis on trial on a world tribunal. Thus, they were sort of paving the way for the day when a world court of some sort would place individuals on trial for crimes against humanity. However, after those trials at the end of World War II sort of went away, I think they were called the Nuremberg Trials, still there was no established International Criminal Court. Well, finally, the World Federalist Association began to campaign for a world court from the time of World War II until it was finally successful. Now, the World Federalist Association was a big believer in one world government. Make no bones about it. They believed all nations should surrender their national sovereignty to a single global authority. So they promoted that point. Still, that was way too radical for most of us. However, something interesting happened. In 1992, a journalist by the name of Strobe Talbot wrote an article for Time magazine called Birth of the Global Nation. And when I saw the article, I immediately bought the magazine. Birth of the Global Nation, because I knew the Bible prophesies that there's a world government coming, and that world government will go wrong. The Antichrist will gain control of it. And so when I saw Time magazine, of all places, one of the most reputable news magazines at the time we have in America, I thought, what in the world is Time magazine doing pushing the birth of the global nation? Well, this particular article was written by a man by the name of Strobe Talbot. I didn't know him at the time. Nevertheless, I read the article with great interest, and he was proposing us moving toward world government. And one statement he made stuck with me to this day. He said, in the 21st century, national sovereignty as we have known it will cease to exist. We'll all answer to a single global authority. I thought, whoa, that's quite a statement. And yet I knew the Bible prophesied a world government was coming. I thought, this guy is promoting the very thing that we want to avoid. Well, he wrote the article in 92, and in 1993, he became Deputy Secretary of State for the United States of America. Bill Clinton asked him to come to the White House to work with him in the State Department. And when that happened, I thought, wait a minute. Surely Clinton does not know that Talbot is a huge promoter of world government. So I did a little research, and I found out that Bill Clinton and Strobe Talbot were roommates together when they were both attending college in London. And I thought, wow, so they're roommates. They know what each other believes, and still Clinton. So apparently Clinton would favor a one world government of some sort. Well, Talbot went to the White House in 93. By the time 1997 rolled around, I was aware that the World Federalist Organization was pushing harder than ever for a system of world law and a world court. But when President Clinton stepped to the podium at the United Nations to greet the leaders of the world, this was in 1997, I listened to every word carefully because it's so significant. But when President Clinton said, now the time has come to establish our International Criminal Court, I froze in place. I thought, oh my goodness, he and Talbot have had their head together, and now President Clinton is openly endorsing the establishment of a world court. Well, it didn't take long. When the leader of the free world places an endorsement, it opens the door for a lot of things to happen. By April of 1998, just about 6 months or so later, there was a conference called to pound out the general structure of the International Criminal Court. So that conference was held in April of 1998. They pounded out a lot of things they needed to produce, and then they held a treaty forming conference in June the 15th through July the 17th of 1998. It was 32 days. And they wrestled with all of the provisions of what was going to be called the International Criminal Court structure of the Treaty of Rome and its International Criminal Court. Now, how did the Treaty of Rome get in there? That's interesting within itself. The European Union was founded by the Treaty of Rome. Now then, we're calling this the Treaty of Rome and its International Criminal Court. Okay, well, they finally reached agreement by July the 17th of 1998. I think there was like 120 nations that voted to accept this new structure, and there were 7 nations that voted against it. Now, President Clinton, he was the prime mover behind all this, but he wanted all cases to be referred to the court by the UN Security Council. Why? Well, because the U.S. has veto power at the UN Security Council, so this would be totally under our control. Anything that we did not want to go to trial would be stopped. So that was President Clinton's plan. However, the other nations of the world saw through this, and now that they're in conference, they can do what they want to do. They opted for an independent prosecutor who could prosecute whoever he wanted to prosecute without a recommendation from the United Nations. On July the 17th of 1998, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court was adopted, as I said, by a vote of 120 to 7, with 21 countries abstaining. The 7 countries that voted against the treaty were China, Iraq, Israel, Libya, Qatar, the United States, and Yemen. Now wait, I thought the United States pushed this to the front. We did. However, once they opted for an independent prosecutor, Bill Clinton realized this was something that could go out of control. Furthermore, they built into the International Criminal Court statute 4 crimes. And one of those crimes was called war crimes. And a war crime was defined as any nation that moves its population into territory occupied during war, or any nation that moves population away from territory occupied by war. Well, everybody knew that that whole thing and the way it was defined was aimed at Israel, because we'd had the 1967 war when Israel took the West Bank. Now, there was a big argument over whether that was actually occupied territory or not, since the Jordanians had occupied it in 1948, and now they had been driven out in 1967. So was it occupied territory, or was this still the British mandate that was not allocated to anyone? Of course, the Israelis thought it was still the British mandate that was not allocated to anyone. Nevertheless, there was this big argument. And that's the reason the United States and Israel voted against the inclusion of war crimes in the particular document. Okay, now, as we continue on, I want you to watch what actually happens here. We're looking at the list of war crimes, and Israel voted against what was happening due to the problems. Now, let's watch what else happened. The action of taking population from your country and actually possessing and absorbing the population of another country, that's what wanted to be avoided, because the world planners planned to take the spoils of war away. Always before, when nations went to battle, whichever side won, they redrew the borders. They took part of the other one's land. But the logic was, if we could take away that incentive to war, really what use would there be to go to war? If after the war and after hundreds of thousands of people died, everybody's got to pull back to the original borders, well, you take away the incentive for war. That's what was thought. So consequently, they wanted to build this into the International Criminal Court statute. Now, there are 4 categories of crimes under the new International Criminal Court, which was formed in 1998 but did not take force until 2002, 4 years later. Here's the 4 categories of crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes of aggression. You say, not a problem with me. I've never done any of those things. I will never do those things. Well, actually, most of you out there probably have already committed one of these crimes. For example, genocide. What is genocide? Well, that's when you try to make war against a specific group of people, a race, a religion, a sexual category, something like that. You say, I've never done that. Well, have you or have you not? For example, I looked up this particular word, genocide, and it said to commit physical harm or mental harm against a minority. Wait, mental harm. How do you know? In other words, if you speak against one of these groups, let's say that you speak against homosexuality because you know the Bible speaks against it. According to this law, you would have committed the crime of genocide. You don't have to touch a person. You don't have to hit a person. You don't have to shoot a person. All you've got to do is cause physical or mental harm. Let's just say I would preach a sermon on Sunday morning against homosexuality or against same-sex marriage, and there's someone there who's a homosexual or who is in a same-sex marriage. They could go out and try to sue me for hate crimes. You say, oh, that's ridiculous. That would never happen. It's already happened. It's already happened north of our border in Canada. 5 years in prison for speaking words. That's all you got to do. You don't have to act at all. Speak words. Or let's say that a same-sex couple comes in and wants you to bake them a cake. You own a bakery. And you say to them, I'm sorry, my religious convictions prohibit me from doing that. Because if I bake a cake and say, congratulations, Dick and Tom, and it's obviously a wedding cake and I'm the one that produced it, it's like I have voted with my own talents to endorse that situation. And I can't do that. Well, right here in America, it's been determined that that's a hate crime. And you can be sued for that. We do not have any hate crime laws yet, except hate crime laws which increase the penalty for certain crimes. In other words, if you kill a person just because you became angry, you would receive a certain sentence. If you kill a person because you hated them because they were homosexual, or because they were black, or because they were white, or because they were Hispanic, then you're guilty of a hate crime. You get an extra 10 years tacked onto your prison term. That's already law here in the United States of America. It should not be. Because a crime is a crime. We've already got laws against murder, against robbery, against rape, against all these other crimes. So we don't need to say, okay, what were you thinking when you said that? I've often laughingly told people, if you're going to shoot somebody, the last thing you should say is, I really love you, boom. Well, that way they can't convict you of a hate crime, which of course is ludicrous, but that's the craziness that this takes us to. Okay, so genocide, crimes of aggression, war crimes. What are those other three? Okay, let's talk about crimes against humanity. That's when you go in war and just slaughter people. It'd be like the Holocaust under Adolf Hitler, a crime against humanity. Well, what's a war crime? Now, that's the one we got to spend a little bit of time on. War crime means that you go in, you take territory, and then you move your population in there. Now, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here. Let's slow down a minute, because that's what a war crime is, and they specifically tailor-made the way this was worded at the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court to fit Israel. Now, the truth of the matter is, Israel is not an occupying power. Jordan illegally occupied the West Bank in the War of Independence in 1948. However, the Balfour Declaration originally had given all this territory to Israel, and the international community endorsed the Balfour Declaration and made it a part of international law. That happened in 1922. However, they changed their mind later, and they've changed their mind since, and so it's been very confusing, and now then they've repeated over and over again, Israel is the occupier. The truth of the matter is, the territory that the Balfour Declaration, and then it was endorsed by the League of Nations, that territory was supposed to belong to Israel. So anyone who's there occupying the territory, they're the occupiers. Nevertheless, the media has harped on it the opposite way until nobody knows what the truth is for sure. Finally, the crime of aggression. What does that mean? Well, that would include if your nation invades another country without original permission from the UN Security Council, you've now committed a crime of aggression. Now, when they first adopted the International Criminal Court, they said nobody could agree on what a crime of aggression was. They said, so we'll wait a while. However, I think it was in 2017, they finally defined the crime of aggression, and here's what it includes: invasion, military occupation, annexation by the use of force, bombardment, military blockade of ports. That's the crime of aggression, which means any nation who goes to war without UN approval, they've committed a crime of aggression. So this International Criminal Court has pretty well wrapped everything up. That's where we are right now. Let me give you the last example. Clinton invaded Yugoslavia way back in, the year 2000. He overthrew Slobodan Milosevic, reinstalled a different government. He did all this under the International Criminal Court statute. You may remember there was a civil war raging in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was ruled by a man by the name of Slobodan Milosevic. He was being pressured to bring Yugoslavia into the European Union. He didn't want to be a part of the EU because he knew that would be the end of Yugoslavian sovereignty. So he resisted. Well, they wanted him in the UN, so they had to find a premise to force the issue. Since part of his empire was Muslim, they began to agitate the Muslims, and civil war developed. As this developed, the international community took it to the United Nations, but the United Nations declined to get involved because it was the internal affairs, and at that time the United Nations was only mandated to deal with conflicts between nations, not domestic conflicts. So the UN wouldn't vote on it. They stayed out. Well, Bill Clinton wanted to finish the goal, and that was to bring Yugoslavia into the United Europe, the European Union. So he went to NATO, and there at NATO, he was able to convince NATO that they had to do this thing. So President Clinton led the charge against Slobodan Milosevic. The bombs began to fall until Yugoslavia was pretty well in ruins. Then it was time for an election in Yugoslavia. The United States of America channeled millions of dollars in there to Slobodan Milosevic's opponent, and sure enough, he lost the election. However, it wasn't done with yet. Now, in the meantime, President Bill Clinton left office and George W. Bush took office. And George W. Bush said to the new president of Yugoslavia, "We want you to extradite Milosevic to the International Criminal Court at The Hague in Holland." The new president said, "I can't do it. We don't have an extradition treaty with you." Bush said, "Well, you better get one. Go to your parliament and pass it." Well, they tried, and it was thunderously defeated. So the president of Yugoslavia went back to President Bush and said, "I tried. They voted it down." President Bush said, "We'll do it like we do it in America. If we can't get it any other way, we just pass an executive order." So the leader of Yugoslavia called his cabinet together, and they passed an executive order. However, Milosevic was ahead of them. He knew what was going on, and he immediately got the Supreme Court of Yugoslavia to declare the executive order illegal. Well, guess what? None of it mattered, because the black helicopter swooped in that night, kidnapped Milosevic, and took him off to Holland to be placed on trial there. Ladies and gentlemen, are you hearing me? The United States of America did that. Bill Clinton and George W. Bush did that. Now, I hate to tell the truth, because I live here in the same town with President Bush. And when you meet him, when you listen to him, he's such a nice guy, great personality. But somehow, apparently, he's for globalism, because he arranged for Milosevic to end up at the International Criminal Court. Well, then the trial waged on and on. The trial lasted 4 years. Milosevic had a lot of health problems, and he got worse, and finally he died while he was yet held in prison. What happened next? You're not going to believe this. But President Clinton was informed that he had won the Charlemagne Peace Prize for the year 2000. Why? Well, the Charlemagne Prize is given to the person that does the most to contribute to European unification. Charlemagne was the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and the European Union is the rebirth of the Holy Roman Empire. And so whoever does the most each year is given $1 million prize, and it's called the Charlemagne Prize because he was the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The present European Union is a revival of the Holy Roman Empire. I've got pictures of Bill Clinton in Aachen, Germany. That's where you have to go to collect your prize. He went there. There's a cathedral there built by Charlemagne himself, completed in 800 AD, and Charlemagne is buried inside. It's a cathedral there. It stood since 800 AD. Well, that's where Clinton went to get his $1 million prize. And we have pictures of him there. And when he was presented the prize, you'll never believe what they said. Because of all that you did to make sure that Yugoslavia was united to the united Europe, we present you with this prize. Clinton thanked everybody and said, I want everyone to know, though, our work is not yet done. What was he saying? Our drive toward world government is not yet over. We not only want to join the European Union together, we want to join the entire world together. Now, Herbert Walker Bush, our 41st president, he was a globalist. He was an internationalist. He believed in the United Nations, and he believed the UN was ultimately to be a one world government. As a matter of fact, he was one of the first ones to declare the New World Order after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany. Well, after his term, then Clinton takes power. He's obviously a globalist. And then once he leaves office, George W. Bush comes to power, and he continues the policy, and he's the one responsible for the arrest of Milosevic and his trial before the International Criminal Court. Actually, Clinton said we cannot ratify the International Criminal Court. He was originally for it. And at the last minute, he signed it. He said, I would rather be in and influencing from within than to be on the outside looking in. So he signed it on the last possible day. And I believe that was of the year 2002, but I'm not sure the exact year. Anyway, he signed it. But when President George W. Bush came to power, he apparently had some misgiving about giving up too much sovereignty. And so he decided to withdraw our signature from the International Criminal Court, which President Bush, that was a wonderful thing that you did there. Thank God because you did that. So when a person does something that's really bad, I tell them, but when they do something good, they also should be given the credit for that. So we withdrew our signature, at which time Israel withdrew its signature, because suddenly we were realizing that our citizens were vulnerable to be placed under arrest, just like Milosevic was, and placed on trial before the International Criminal Court. So what's happening as a result of all this today? There are articles this week in the news. One article was entitled, Trump official John Bolton declares International Criminal Court dangerous and dead to America. This comes from The Independent out of the United Kingdom on September the 10th. National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, John Bolton, has said the International Criminal Court is dead to us in his latest speech. He labeled the court as illegitimate, and for all intents and purposes, the ICC is already dead to the U.S. Mr. Bolton, who has long held an unfavorable view of the court, who was speaking at a meeting of the Federalist Society, not the same thing as the World Federalist Organization. The Federalist Society, a conservative group based in Washington, D.C., said the International Criminal Court was ineffective, unaccountable, and indeed outright dangerous. The court, established in 2002, that's when they got enough signatures to enact it, in The Hague, in the Netherlands, has the power to prosecute individuals for war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and now crimes of aggression. The U.S. never ratified the Rome Statute that established the court, and George W. Bush, in the early days of the still ongoing war in Afghanistan, never ratified it. Now, the court is getting ready to investigate detainee abuse in Afghanistan, an investigation Mr. Bolton called utterly unfounded, adding, "We will provide no cooperation to the ICC." The former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations under Mr. Bush went on to say the central aim of the ICC, most vigorous supporters, was to constrain the U.S., to put us under international control. So, you understand what I'm saying to you? I'm telling you that this world court that was enacted in 1998, or actually created in 1998 and finally enacted in 2002, it's in power now and is trying to take U.S. soldiers and place them on trial. Now, Mr. Bolton said the court statute had glaring, significant flaws and constituted an assault on the constitutional rights of the American people and the sovereignty of the United States. Now, let's make sure we get this right. If the U.S. bows the knee to this International Criminal Court, any of us could be arrested and placed on trial. Let's just say someone filed a complaint against you in England where they've signed on to the court, and you're going on tourism in England. You come to the border, you don't know a complaint has been filed against you. But when you put your passport down, all of a sudden on the computer screen, it shows that there's a warrant for your arrest from the International Criminal Court. People quietly slip up behind you and put the handcuffs on you, and now you're at the International Criminal Court. You're saying, oh, but that wouldn't happen. Oh, it's already happened. The first thing they did was to use helicopters to come in to sovereign territory of Yugoslavia and kidnap Mr. Milosevic. But that's not all. They've now filed charges against presidents. President of Sudan, Bashar al-Assad, he right now is under a warrant for his arrest. He's avoided arrest so far by staying inside of his own country, or at least going to other countries who promise him they will not turn him in to the International Criminal Court. Now, I'm not telling you something that may be happening. I'm telling you something that's happening right now. Remember what we're talking about? Do you believe in world government or not? Should there be a court system above the Supreme Court of the United States or not? Should you be able to be placed on trial without the protection of the U.S. Constitution nor the Bill of Rights? There is no U.S. Constitution at the International Criminal Court. There are no Bill of Rights at the International Criminal Court. And yet right now it's pushing because it sees its claims to global governance going down the tubes under the Trump-Bolton administration. That's what this article is all about. They're trying to take some of our soldiers and say, you misuse prisoners. So here's the question. Is world government coming or not? It is. Your Bible prophesies a world government is coming. And it will ultimately be ruled by a man called the Antichrist. And I'm not talking about 50 years from now or 100 years from now. I'm talking about in the very near future. However, we don't want the United States of America to be a part of that one world government, which means we've got to get away. Now, let me just tell you bluntly that we were moving as fast as we could go until this crazy guy by the name of Donald Trump stepped on the platform with 16 other Republicans and began to speak against globalism and speaking against the establishment that had been preparing America for merging into the one world government. For a long time, they had been getting ready for this. Let me finish this article that I'm on, then I'm going to come and take your calls. Mr. Bolton, following a trend in the Trump administration of criticizing multilateralism. Okay, stop. Do you know what multilateralism means? You better. It's one world government. It's ruling the world with all the nations colluding at the United Nations in a one world government. That's called multilateralism. You say, why do they use words like that? Because they don't want you to realize what they're really talking about. But the Trump administration criticizing multilateralism or global government, that's easier to understand, branded the ICC as a freewheeling global organization governing over individuals without their consent. He claimed American soldiers, politicians, and private citizens are at risk because the court assumes the automatic right to prosecute over everyone, even in countries which did not ratify the Rome Statute establishing the court, including the United States of America. We did not ratify it. And yet they're trying to put our soldiers on trial. Finally, we conclude with this. Bolton said, we don't recognize any authority higher than the U.S. Constitution. Well, I say amen to that. But don't forget, after you listen to all of the noise and all of the chaos and all the arguments, remember what's at stake in less than 50 days. Do we continue away from world government, or do we suddenly get sucked back in by the powers that were leading us pell-mell toward world government before the 2016 elections? Okay, critical. You need to understand what's going on. Zippy Livni of Israel was planning a trip to the United Kingdom. She was asked to speak there. And she found out there was a warrant for her arrest that had been taken out by a private citizen for crimes against humanity because she was the Secretary of State in the last war in Israel. And she had to cancel her trip. An Israeli general was on a plane. He landed in Great Britain. His government contacted him and said, do not get off that plane. They're waiting outside to arrest you. He stayed on the plane, returned to Israel. He was going to be arrested for war crimes because he had participated in the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Now, that's the kind of thing that could spread so fast, and it will, I promise you it will, during the Great Tribulation.